Nature of biology, connecting everyday phenomena with the laws of nature in living earth biology. What is science? The nature of science is nature. By this we mean that science investigates the natural world. Science assumes but never proves that the universe follows laws of nature. Science seeks to explain phenomena in terms of natural causes alone. This includes biology. So, what is biology? Well, of course, it's a science. We're interested in how biology relates to other fields of study, to other kinds of science. To help you understand this, we're going to use a diagram called the hierarchical pyramid. The basic idea is that the bottom of the pyramid comes first, the top of the pyramid comes last, and the different layers of the pyramid represent different ideas and how they relate to each other. So we're just going to use this symbol of the hierarchical pyramid to understand the relation of biology to the other sciences. Now, before we talk about any of the other sciences, we need to mention math. Math provides tools for measuring basic quantities. Now, we all know that math is a tool, and we should know that math and science are not the same thing. So the math is not inside the pyramid, but it's on the base of the pyramid. The pyramid of science is based upon mathematics. So math by itself isn't science, but you certainly do need some math whenever you're doing science. Physics is the most basic of the science because it studies the basic things like matter, motion, and energy. And as just like physics is the base of the pyramid, physics is the first of the modern sciences. It comes first precisely because it studies basic things. Now, physicists are interested in basic things like matter, motion, and energy. Chemistry studies all the different ways that matter and energy can be arranged. Today, biology and other fields of study are based to some degree on both chemistry and physics. That is, biology is based on chemistry, and chemistry is based on physics. And there are other things at the very top of the pyramid, other stuff that are based upon biology. And some of those things are fully sciences, and some of them aren't quite there yet. So that's the way things are now. We have different sciences based on each other, but it wasn't always this way. To understand the nature of science today, it's helpful to consider the achievements of earlier civilizations. Our ancestors spent a lot of time looking at the night sky. People in Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, Persia, and Asia, India and China, they all built impressive structures to study the heavens. They discovered regular patterns in the way the night sky changed during the year, and they used their knowledge of these patterns in agriculture, navigation, and the construction of calendars. Very impressive. Very clever. The ruins of these ancient observatories are still impressive, but observation by itself is not science. Something else is needed. Math was a very important addition that helped make science possible. In the same way, mathematicians in Greece, India, and Arabia also discovered patterns that proved useful in architecture, art, music, and engineering. The modern world still values the math developed by these ancient peoples, yet math by itself is just a tool and not the same thing as science. The surprising truth is that what we call science today is a recent innovation. Until recently, very few people worked full-time as scientists. Thus, most of the scientists who have ever lived are still alive today. The word scientist wasn't even coined until the 19th century. Prior to that time, people who explored the natural world were called naturalists or natural philosophers. These early thinkers rarely did experiments. Instead, they attempted to explain natural phenomena the same way the ancient Greeks tried to solve philosophical problems with logic and clever arguments. This is a famous painting by the Renaissance painter Raphael. It's called The School of Athens. It shows the philosopher Socrates and his student Plato walking and talking, discussing ideas, while a crowd of people basically just stood around and listened. This was called the School of Athens. During this time, It was very common for clever people to develop arguments and go back and forth with each other. And people tended to think that whoever had the argument that seemed the most clever, they were the correct person, and therefore that was the correct explanation. They didn't test their ideas. Now, this picture from many years later shows something very different. It shows a scientist using a bunch of tools to try to carefully measure the skeleton of a bird. It's called Science's Measurement. This painting by Henry Stace Marks has a very different attitude. You're measuring, you're testing your ideas, you're not having a philosophical debate. You're doing science. So while there have always been very clever people who approach natural phenomena differently, this approach, where you test your ideas, was only near the end of the 16th century that thinkers began to emphasize the usefulness of math in describing those phenomena and the important role that experiment plays in testing our ideas. As a result, physics only became a modern science, mathematical and testable, during the time of Galileo and Newton during the 17th century. Eventually, both chemistry in the middle of the 19th century and biology in the middle of the 20th century, they eventually also became fully sciences, both testable and mathematical. But remember, physics came first. Biology is based on chemistry, and chemistry is based on physics. Now we're going to talk about scientific method. To do that, we're going to use an acronym called O.H.E.C.K, where every letter stands for a statement. Now, just as there's more than one way to make a cake, there's no one recipe for doing science. I don't want you to think that O.H.E.C is the rule. O.H.E.C is just Mr. Hatfield's way of teaching the logic of how science works, but that logic can take other forms. So O stands for observation. H is for the hypothesis. E is experiment. C is a conclusion. And K is a two-word phrase, knowledge sharing. Observations are how science begins. We see phenomena. This comes from a Greek word phenomenos, which basically just means anything that makes you wonder why. If you see something, you notice something, but you don't really wonder about it, well, that's just an event. But if it triggers a question in your mind, you wonder about it, it is a phenomenon. And anyone can make an observation and wonder why. H is the hypothesis. It's any idea that's proposed to explain a phenomena. Hypothesis and phenomena are both fancy sounding words with Greek roots, and it sounds very fancy, but the hypothesis is really just a maybe it's because. It's just an idea from your imagination that you come up with in an attempt to explain something you've noticed that puzzles you, that makes you wonder. It's a maybe it's because. Let's do a little bit more detail on the hypothesis. First of all, you can get a valid hypothesis from any source. Since you can get it from any source, you don't necessarily have to do research first or go to college or be super educated. So if you've been told that a hypothesis is an educated guess, strictly speaking, that's not true. A hypothesis is not, contrary to what you may have been told, an educated guess. Hey, it's just a guess. But it can't be any guess. It's got to be a certain kind of guess, a certain kind of a hypothesis. Because the hypothesis can be either falsifiable or non-falsifiable. Now that's a new word. Falsifiable doesn't mean true, it doesn't mean false. It means there's a way in principle to test it that you might be able to prove it false. Now why does this matter? It matters because non-falsifiable claims are not allowed in science. They might be true, but they can't be used in science. The example I like to use is that many of us have pets, and pets are just act like they love us, and they're excited, they bark, they want to lick us, and they're very happy when we come home. And so it's very tempting to say, hey, I love my dog, and I think my dog loves me. There's nothing wrong with that. And you know what? It's probably true. The dog probably does feel an emotion that's something like love for you. But the problem is, how do we test what's really going on inside the mind of another being? I mean, it's hard enough to do with people. How would we do it with a dog? What is it like to have the mind of a dog? We just don't know. We don't have the ability to make a lot of direct observations into the mind of another living thing. And so this turns out it's a very difficult and maybe impossible thing to test. So it might be true, but the non-falsifiable claim, we're just not going to be able to do science on it. And that may sound disappointing, but actually, that's one of the secrets to the success of science. We only attempt to test claims that can be tested. There's no point in trying to test something that can't be tested. Now, speaking more precisely, in biology, we treat the hypothesis as a tentative explanation. Tentative, T-E-N-T-A-T-I-V-E, that's a new word. Tentative basically means we're pretending it's true for the purpose of doing an experiment. We don't know if it's true, we pretend it's true. We treat it like it's true. It's like you run a flag up the flagpole. Does anyone salute it? We take a car out for a test drive. How's it going to work? So the hypothesis is just kind of like that. It's just like a test drive for some observation, and maybe we can validate that observation by doing an experiment. Now, experiment, of course, is just what we do to test our ideas. Somewhat surprisingly, scientists often attempt to falsify ideas rather than prove things true. It's often easier. The example I like to give is that I could have a hypothesis like all bananas are yellow. Well, that's actually not true. There's bananas that aren't, but let's pretend that that's true. All bananas are yellow. Okay, well, how would we test that idea? Are we really going to go and look at every banana in the world and check if it's yellow? When you phrase it that way, that's difficult to prove true, maybe even impossible. But if I want to falsify it, all I have to do is find one banana that's not yellow. I don't have to test all the bananas in the world. I just have to find one banana that's not yellow. So again, it's often easier to falsify an idea rather than to prove things true. Now, in order to prove anything one way or the other, your experiment has to be well designed. A well-designed experiment attempts to test a hypothesis under controlled conditions. That means that we're only allowing things to change that we're interested in investigating. We don't allow other things to change while we're doing the experiment because we don't want that to accidentally affect what we're trying to do. We're going to control things. A poorly designed experiment might give a result, but it might not prove anything. It might not mean anything. But a well-designed experiment does a good job of accounting for factors which could potentially change during the experiment, and we call those factors variables. Now, the control variable is one that we deliberately keep the same. It's the same before and it's the same after. We don't let it change in the middle of the experiment because we don't want it to potentially affect what we're trying to actually test. Other factors are things that we deliberately change, right? We're in the middle of the experiment and we change something, or we have two different versions of the experiment where it's different. We say that's a manipulated variable. This is an aspect which is deliberately changed. Our responding variable is something that we don't keep it the same, but we don't deliberately change it. We allow it to change. That is, we do the experiment, and if it happens to change, that's okay. And if it does, we say it's a responding variable, and we hope that it's responding as a result of the experiment. We say hope because this is hard to hear, but we just can't control everything, right? We're not really in complete control of nature. Even when we do a very careful experiment and we do control a lot of things, we can't control everything. And so we have what are called independent variables. Independent variables are uncontrolled items. They're going to change regardless of the experiment's design. The usual example of an independent variable is time, because we started an experiment. We've got a beginning and an end. So between the beginning and the end of the experiment, time takes place. And, time typically moves in just one direction, and here on planet Earth, at a constant rate of change. So it will change regardless of what we do, and we can't stop that. It's an independent variable. We just have to account for that when we do our design. To help us understand the differences between these kinds of variables, we have a famous experiment. It's called Reddy's experiment. Reddy was interested in testing an idea called spontaneous germination. People thought that non-living matter, things that were rotting, garbage, really, they thought garbage could become a living thing. So, for example, a farmer might see frogs crawling out from a pile of wet, stinky hay in his field. He might think, oh, the wet hay is turning into frogs, right? That was the idea. So to test it, Reddy got some meat from a butcher shop. He put the meat in jars that were open to the environment, and he put them outside. And of course, the meat It starts to go bad and it attracts flies. Those are all things that were kept the same, they're controlled. But some of the jars he left open, and some of the jars were covered with cloth. The smell of the meat could get out, but the flies couldn't get in. So that's the manipulated variable. What happens? Well, the meat, you leave it out, it goes bad on both sides. But on the side that the jars are left open, we see little worms start crawling out of the meat, maggots. Whereas the meat that's in the covered jars, it goes bad, it smells bad too, but we don't see any maggots. So not all of the meat turned into maggots. So we now know that what's actually happening here is that flies are attracted to meat because they want to lay their eggs in the meat. And so the maggot, the little worms that appear, those are actually the larval juvenile form of the fly. Reddy probably didn't know that, but he probably suspected that the idea of spontaneous germination was wrong and it needed to be disproved. So he used this experiment to falsify that hypothesis. And we now know that what's happening here is that the flies are laying eggs, and you just can't see them with the naked eye because they're microscopic. And in Francisco Reddy's day, there weren't hardly any microscopes. Now, with our experimental design, we get data on what happens. Right, Reddy would have data on how many worms were produced and in which situations, and those are things that are numbered. So we often have to graph our experimental data. Since responding variables depend on things which are being deliberately changed, we refer to them as dependent variables. These will be plotted on the y-axis. Whereas both manipulated and independent variables, they'll change regardless of what happens on the y-axis, up and down. So we treat them as the same and we plot them on the x-axis. And so this memory aid, dependent responding y, dry, manipulated independent mix, we say dry mix. We're going to use this memory aid in this course to help you remember how to graph your data. Just remember in practice, dependent and responding we treat as the same, and manipulated and independent are treated as the same. So we do the experiment, and if we do careful collection of data, we might get a result, and we have an idea what it means. We call this a conclusion. Conclusions are often the shortest part of a scientific paper. That is, we'll spend a lot of time telling people what we're interested in and how we're going to investigate it, how we did our experiment. But at the end, we tell people what the results were, and we say what they mean. Now, if this experiment is really novel, if it's something new, we're going to share it. And so K is often left out of discussions of scientific method in high school courses, but because it's still very important. We need to share the information. So we got to tell the rest of the world, specifically, we got to tell the scientific community, because the scientific community is going to take our research and it becomes an observation for someone else's science. And so this starts a cycle of improvement. That is, your K becomes someone else's O, and it just goes on and on. In the long run, secrecy is the enemy of science. Now, suppose we try to disprove a hypothesis many, many, many times, but no matter what we do, how we test it, it survives our attempts to falsify it. Well, we still don't know if it's true or not, but it becomes sensible to take it more seriously, and we build our research programs around those ideas. Look at the pyramid of science here. Hypothesis, of course, is on top of observation. It's proposed to explain the observation. But if you test a hypothesis many, many times, we start thinking it's more powerful. We start thinking it's more than just a maybe it's because, and we actually design our research around it. These powerful, useful ideas are called theories. Our definition of a theory is that it is a well-tested explanation for a broad set of observations. I'll say that again. A theory is a well-tested explanation for a broad set of observations. So a theory is higher on the pyramid of science because since it's been tested many, many times in many different ways, it now explains a lot of observations. It's a lot more powerful than a hypothesis. Now, in addition to that, well, let's look at this, because this picture represents the most powerful theory that science has ever come up with. It's called the Standard Model. It includes gravity, electricity, magnetism, the structure of atoms, and a whole bunch of things that are beyond the scope of a high school science course. It's so powerful, it makes accurate predictions to like 22, 23 powers of 10. This is literally the best thing that science has ever come up with, which means it's one of the greatest achievements of our modern civilization. If it's that good, if it's that powerful, if it's that accurate, are we happy with it? The answer is we are not happy. We're still trying to test it. Here you see this man, he's standing in a tunnel that's a couple stories tall, and the tunnel is buried hundreds of feet below ground. And the actual tunnel is a big circle that's more than 100 miles wide. It's so big it takes up parts of 3 separate countries, France, Switzerland, and Italy. This is the biggest machine that's ever been built in the history of the world. It's inside a tunnel. If you had to build it from scratch, it would cost trillions and trillions of dollars. It holds a machine that is the biggest and most powerful machine that's ever been built. It's designed to take atoms and pound them together at ridiculously high energies to see what happens when the atoms break. And the whole purpose of this machine is that it's been built to test the standard model. Because the standard model is so good, you need a machine like no other to test it. So as good and as interesting as the standard model is, as important as it is, we don't think it's the final version. Science doesn't stop. It just keeps on going. So one of the things we end up finding is that when we investigate nature, we end up noticing that there's some things that appear to be true everywhere, no matter what. We call those things a scientific law or law of nature. And you'll see that law is above a theory. It's actually more powerful than a theory because it's absolutely universally true. But it doesn't actually explain anything. A law summarizes a whole bunch of observations and experiments, but it does not explain them. It's simply a brute fact about nature. Because it's very general, it can be expressed in the form of an equation, and it appears to be always true all the time, everywhere in the universe. A familiar example of a law is gravity. Here you see the Earth and the Moon, and there's an attraction between the Earth and the Moon. And the Earth pulls on the Moon pulls on the Earth. And we can describe that as a law. The full name of the law is the law of universal gravitation. It's a law because it's true everywhere. If we ever looked out in the universe and we saw planets and moons not obeying the law of gravity in some part of the universe, well, it wouldn't be a law then. But no matter which direction we point our telescopes, no matter how deep we look back into time, everything seems to obey this, and so we call it a law. Now, as mentioned, laws can be described as equations. Here we have some symbols. The force of gravitational attraction between two heavenly bodies like the Earth and the Moon can be expressed as an equation.